If you know about aviation in Papua New Guinea, you've probably also heard of the dubious safety record that accompanies it. The country's communities scattered across the mountainous landscape are isolated by treacherous and impenetrable rainforests. Many of the towns and villages are days away from cities and critical supplies by road, if they're even connected at all, making transport by air critical to modern-day PNG. However, the same mountains and rainforests which create one of the most unique places for flying in the world also create some of the most dangerous hazards to aviation that can be encountered, from unmapped mountain peaks to the tiny runway strips on the side of them. In PNG, aircraft accidents are not an uncommon sight, and before 2011, wrapped up in one of the worst streaks of crashes was one of the country's largest airlines. 7 fatal crashes in 24 years made it one of the worst carriers in an already unsafe country for flying, and the accident that will bring an end to this deadly streak would be the worst crash in the history of aviation in PNG. On the 13th of October 2011, Airlines PNG Flight 1600 is being refueled and readied for departure at Lae Nadzab International Airport. The passengers are boarding, the cargo is being loaded, and the pilots are preparing the aircraft for departure. Flight 1600 will be taking a relatively short hop to Madang, a small town on PNG's north coast, before jumping over to the capital of Papua New Guinea, Port Moresby. Setting a course for Madang will be more complex than simply pointing in the right direction. Standing in the way is the Finisterre Range, with an unnamed highest peak of 13,620 feet, only known locally as Mount Boising. It wouldn't be first officially ascended until 2014. The range providing a natural barrier when travelling south to north, Flight 1600 will first depart to the west, tracking via waypoint Miral, then over Yati, and climbing over the ranges at a cruise altitude of 16,000 feet, before making its final descent into Madang. The plane carrying the 29 passengers and 3 crew on the journey up north is a Bombardier Dash 8-100, a twin turboprop aircraft. A turboprop engine generates its power in the same way as a jet engine. In fact, it is a jet at heart, with a propeller attached to the turbine, which provides the vast majority of the power, optimized for relatively low speed, low altitude flights when compared with larger jet aircraft, perfect for operations in Papua New Guinea. This Dash 8, registered MCJ, has been a part of Airlines PNG since 2003, and it is beginning to show signs of its age. The yaw damper has been written up as inoperative. It's designed to do exactly what its name suggests, to damper or lessen the yaw that occurs throughout the flight by providing tiny control inputs to the rudder. It being inoperative will have no effect on the operation or the safety of the flight itself, except for the fact that it also renders the autopilot inoperative, so the handling of the aircraft will be fully left up to the pilots. The 2 pilots up on the flight deck are 64-year-old Captain Bill Spencer and 40-year-old First Officer Campbell Wagstaff. Both are expats from Australia. They have a combined 20,000 flight hours, with just under 500 each on the Dash 8, something which could be a factor in what occurs later in the flight. It's not uncommon for flights in PNG to be operated by expat pilots. Many see the formidable flying environment as an attractive place to start off their career, with low experience requirements and unique flying conditions, making Papua an exciting option for young pilots looking to jumpstart their careers. Captain Spencer and First Officer Wagstaff are by no means in the category of young pilots, however. Their experience shows in the impressively high number of flight hours. But despite all this, some unusual events that will occur later in the flight will result from some split-second decisions. There is nothing usual about flying in PNG, and that even includes the history of Lae Nadzab. Located 26 miles from Lae, Papua New Guinea's second biggest city, NADSAB has been serving the area since 1977. It was redeveloped as a part of an independence gift from Australia, and became the primary airport for the city after the former was mysteriously burnt to the ground, amidst fierce political squabbling. Nevertheless, aviation finds a way, and at 4:47 PM local time, Airlines PNG 1600 takes off from NADSAB, setting initial course to the west. As the flight approaches its first waypoint, it's already clear that not everything will go as planned. There's a thunderstorm located on the direct track between Yati and Madang. Storms are common in PNG at this time of year, so it's a relatively routine task for the pilots to avoid it and its associated lightning, turbulence, and icing. They deviate to the right of the planned track, flying directly over the towering Finisterre Ranges. Despite the spectacular view it provides to the passengers, flying along this new route will create an additional challenge for the pilots. Since the plane must remain safely above the ranges until relatively close to Madang, quite a steep descent will be required once they clear the high terrain. Adding to this, as the flight approaches its top of descent point, a further complication is reported on the radio.
Madang Tower, Alpha Bravo Charlie, just to let you know, there's a cell to the east here that appears to be approaching the field.
Alpha Bravo Charlie, roger.
With the additionally reported weather ahead, the captain's focus now changes to outside the aeroplane. He sees the cloud associated with the reported storm, and with some urgency, decides to begin descent to get below it. He wants to remain clear of the cloud so he can make a visual approach onto runway 07. It's soon apparent that both the captain and first officer start becoming distracted by the weather, as they solely focus on staying clear of the clouds. Remember that full manual control of the plane is in the hands of Captain Spencer, but he nor the FO notices that the airspeed is creeping up towards VMO, the maximum operating airspeed for the Dash 8. And as the aircraft descends through 10,500 feet, with a rate of descent of up to 4,200 feet per minute, the overspeed warning sounds.
Shit!
The captain looks back inside and slams the power levers back, while raising the nose to bring the airspeed back. All of a sudden, a deafening noise comes from the propellers. Villagers on the ground even report hearing a loud bang, and smoke begins to enter the cabin, while an abundance of alarms and warnings are set off in the cockpit. The pilots are going to have to formulate a response immediately, but let's slow everything down to explain exactly what has happened, because it's going to be a major issue. When the aircraft was descending normally, the propellers were rotating at 900 revolutions per minute, or RPM. As the propellers rotate, they generate forward power by effectively acting like a wing. A slight angle of attack combined with the blade's rotation takes a bite out of the air, forcing it backwards and the aeroplane forwards. So, there are two ways to increase power, either by increasing the RPM or increasing the blade angle. In the cockpit, the RPM is controlled through the condition levers, while the power levers control the torque. If more torque, or effectively more power, is requested, the engines will work harder and the blade angle will increase to keep the RPM the same. 900 RPM is the minimum selectable and the normal setting for cruise flight, since it allows the propellers to rotate at the most efficient angle of attack. The condition levers can be selected up to 1200 RPM, which is usually reserved for takeoffs and go-arounds, where efficiency is thrown out the window and maximum power needs to be delivered. When the aircraft is taxiing though, the power required is so low that the position of the condition levers does not matter, with the power levers below the flight idle detent operating in what is known as ground beta mode. The engines operate at idle and only provide a tiny portion of their full power, but still more than enough to move the aircraft. The power levers therefore operate in a different mode. Instead of controlling torque, they directly control the blade angle of the propellers. increasing it to accelerate the aircraft as it taxis, and decreasing it all the way to 0 when no power is needed at all. It's prohibited for the power levers to be reduced into the ground beta mode in flight, because it could lead to a propeller overspeed. However, as the captain slams the power levers back, he brings them all the way past the flight idle D10 and into the ground beta mode. Here, the props stop acting as propellers and begin to act more like windmills, with the oncoming airflow increasing the RPM far beyond their designed limit. The deafening noise in the cabin and the bang heard by the villagers on the ground is the sound of the propeller tips exceeding the speed of sound, generating a sonic boom that can travel for miles. A propeller control unit malfunction forces the right engine into an uncommanded feather, rendering it useless, while the left engine far exceeds its design limits, accelerating up to 1900 RPM. It becomes severely damaged in the process, pouring smoke into the bleed air system which is delivered into the cabin.
What have we done?
We've had a double propeller overspeed.
What have we done?
We've had a double propeller overspeed and the right engine has shut down.
I can't hear ya.
The deafening noise coming from the still overspeeding left prop makes communication between the pilots virtually impossible, as they sit stunned by what's occurring before their very eyes. It's not until the airspeed begins to slow that the propeller RPM reduces back into the normal range. The first officer repeats his diagnosis.
The right engine has shut down. Is the left still working?
That's not working. We got nothing.
Nothing.
It's at this point, 40 seconds after the propeller overspeed began, that the pilots realise they're going to have to make an emergency landing. The right engine is still operating, but the damage to it won't allow it to be taken out of feather, where the propeller blade points 90 degrees into the relative airflow, thus producing nil thrust. The left engine has been completely cooked by the overspeed. It's simply windmilling in the forward airflow, something which will add further complications in the following minutes.
Make a mayday call to Madang.
Okay.
The first task the crew elect to carry out is to get in contact with air traffic control. The first officer declares a mayday with Madang Tower and gives them the current GPS coordinates of the aircraft, first stating that they'll be ditching off the coast, but then after rethinking with the captain, deciding that they will land in the mouth of the dried up Guab River. This whole radio exchange with ATC takes up a total of 63 seconds. Meanwhile, the left engine is still windmilling, creating significant drag and making the aircraft difficult to control. While airliners aren't exactly designed to glide without power, the Dash 8 is virtually falling out of the sky, descending at an average rate of 2,500 feet per minute, a rate that momentarily increases to 6,000 as the overspeed warning sounds yet again. It's not until they're 800 feet above the ground, 72 seconds before impact, that the captain directs the FO to
shut everything down.
Okay.
The first officer finally secures the left propeller. The crippling drag it's been producing is ceased, but there are still problems for the crew. They look down at the riverbed, and while it is dry, they see it contains large boulders, obviously extremely hazardous to a landing aircraft. So the captain decides to line up with an area beside the riverbed, hoping it could provide at least a slightly more ideal area for landing. But the plane is nowhere close to being properly configured to land. With both engines shut down, no power is available to the landing gear or flaps, meaning there will be no shock absorbing benefit of the wheels, and the touchdown will be much faster than usual. It's also perhaps for this reason that the aircraft overshoots the captain's planned landing spot. It crashes 35 kilometers southeast of Madang. The tail impacts first, and while the captain's decision to avoid the boulders in the riverbed appeared appropriate at the time, the area of thick vegetation also contains similar boulders. The front of the aircraft separates from the rear, rotates through 180 degrees, and rolls upside down as it comes to rest. It leaves behind a 300-meter long wreckage trail, with debris littering the banks of the Guab River. Out of the 32 people on board PNG Airlines Flight 1600, 28 received fatal injuries. Just the 2 pilots and the flight attendant survive, as does 1 passenger seated in 7B. Controlled crash landings are actually known to be relatively survivable. As to what went wrong in this case, the PNG Accident Investigation Commission looked at 4 key factors. The aircraft hit the ground at a speed of 114 knots, but this could have been reduced to 89 knots if the highest flap setting was used. It did actually stay relatively intact upon the sudden deceleration, and it's likely everyone was wearing their seatbelts. However, as described by the surviving passenger, the post-crash smoke and fire became very intense very quickly. They only escaped through a small hole in the roof above them, while the pilots and flight attendant found a gap in the side of the fuselage to crawl through. It's likely that everyone else was not so lucky, and perished either as a result of the impact force or the post-crash fire. How avoidable was the crash landing though? The malfunction obviously took the pilots by surprise, but was their response fully appropriate? And could it have been possible to reach a more survivable outcome? The trigger for the accident sequence was when the airspeed went above VMO. So let's talk about urgent situations in aircraft. An airspeed above VMO event would seem one of the most urgent situations a pilot could face, and Captain Spencer's response was rapid. But in the end, it led to a crash landing of the aircraft, clearly not a desirable outcome. So was his response entirely appropriate? Let's take a look at the facts and determine just how urgent the situation was. Going above VMO is a big no-no for pilots. It's indicated by red markings, and the name itself stands for maximum operating airspeed. However, going above VMO is actually a fairly benign event. There's still an abundance of safety margin between VMO and the design maximum speed of the airframe. Going above it for a few moments was not going to put the aircraft at risk. What could have, and did however, was responding to it incorrectly. Instead of easing back on the torque and gently bringing the speed back, Captain Spencer slammed the power levers back erroneously past the flight idle detent. Resulting was a double propeller overspeed. And as we saw in the accident sequence, this created a challenging environment for even the most competent of pilots. The startle effect in aviation is a phenomenon that happens when a sudden or unexpected event occurs with little warning. It's likely that startle effects became well developed in both the captain and FO in such a challenging environment, possibly explaining why they elected to contact ATC in a lengthy exchange before running the emergency landing checklist and securing the wildly out of control left engine. The incorrect initial response to the emergency resulted in a disorganized, hastily managed situation all the way to the ground. The same out of control engine generated significant drag, and therefore a high rate of descent. It reduced the amount of time the crew had to deal with the emergency, as well as narrowed their options for where to put the plane down. In ideal conditions, the Dash 8-100 can glide 2.5 nautical miles for every 1,000 feet of altitude lost. If everything was under control and secured by 7,500 feet, then it could have flown for another 19 nautical miles or 35 kilometers. Just enough that it could have even made it to Madang. While unfair to ping this on the flight crew, it does show how many more options would have been available if the emergency was responded to correctly. The response from the pilots was obviously a factor in the accident. They were pointed to in the findings by the Accident Investigation Commission, but also a factor was the aircraft. Bombardier, who was the manufacturer of the Dash 8 at the time, knew that bringing the power levers into the beta range would be hazardous in flight, so they built a series of obstacles to a pilot inadvertently trying to do so. A physical trigger was installed on the underside of the power lever handles, which had to be lifted to bring the power levers back through the flight idle detent. Captain Spencer, on PNG 1600, likely initially lifted the triggers as part of his muscle memory. The only other time he would ever bring the power levers back so abruptly would be on landing. In some models of the Dash 8-100, a beta lockout system was fitted, where it was impossible for the power levers to be brought back into ground beta mode in flight. However, the only country where a beta lockout was required was the US. Pilots are only human, thus showing the importance of ergonomics and human factors in the design of modern day aircraft. Because if something can possibly go wrong, eventually it will. As a result of PNG 1600 and other similar occurrences of propeller overspeeds, beta lockout systems have become required on turboprops all around the world since 2013. The hazards of flying in Papa will always exist, but if the lessons are learned from the accidents of the past, there's no reason that flying in the most unique place in the world can't be as safe as the rest of the world. In the coming months, you're going to see some new types of videos coming from 3 Greens. The air crash videos will still be as consistent as ever, but I'm as excited as ever to venture into some other areas of aviation as well. We're going on a journey, and if you'd like to be a part of it, check out my YouTube membership page. As a 3 Greens member, you'll not only get access to videos early, and be able to read my highlights of every accident report, but also play a role in the journey that the channel takes over the next few months and years. So if this video has earned it, click on that join button at the bottom of your screen. I'm so excited to see you over there.